Before we get started with talking about resistance, I want to tell you about Sean. Sean was sitting in a conference room with his head hanging down, and the school principal, very directly and um, not unkindly, presented the reasons for the meeting. He wanted to present these reasons so that everybody could understand what had happened and find an appropriate course of action. So, in addition to Sean and the administrator, his mother was there, two police detectives, his academic advisor, and also a counselor were there. Um, Sean was a gifted athlete. He had very capable intellect, but he had kind of struggled to find his way at this school and now had been accused of possible criminal behavior on campus. And his youthful bravado was kind of crumbling uh, with his mother's glare at him. And he's clearly at a crossroads here. Growth is still possible. Um, he's mumbling through a cursory review of kind of what happened. And the detective is unhappy with Sean's just degree of disclosure here and decided a little bit more pressure was required to force open the small crack that was starting to show on Sean's face. And the detective recited the possible charges and the accompanying sentences if Sean did not come clean and were tried as an adult. And his mom was disappointed and angry, and that was showing on her face. So when the detective started talking like this, her face shifts to a worried furrow. And now she's concerned for her son's freedom, and she wondered aloud about needing an attorney. And the detective acknowledged her right to make that choice and pressed on. And then it happens that, a very barely discernible Sean flexes his jaw muscle, and just a moment before there had been uncertainty. Now there's resolution. The harder the detective pushed, the tighter that he clamped down. And his mother, furious with him only just moments before, now turns her anger on the school and the detective. And the principal is kind of walking a tightrope between the safety needs of the school and a learning opportunity for the student. And that was knocked free of his line by the mother's request to take a break and consult with an attorney. So the other detective, maybe wanting to play good cop, never said a word. So the practitioner followed Sean and his mom into the hall and asked to speak to them briefly. It was pretty clear that Sean had engaged in the alleged behavior. There's evidence, including statements by his peers, and all of this is overwhelming as to his culpability. And it's also a new behavior, according to the other students. So he was hurt, and he was a troubled young man from a single parent family where his mom is struggling to fulfill all those roles and make ends meet. So in previous chats with Sean, it had become really clear that trust was the central issue. And it was also clear that this would be this particular practitioner's last chance to talk to him, given what had just transpired. And at 17, it might also be Sean's last chance to look inward at his choices and his life direction before really experiencing some of the adult consequences related to those. So after informing them that this was a clinical discussion and would not be shared with the people in the conference room, the practitioner apologized for the direction that the meeting had gone. And so it was not the intent of the principal for this meeting to be so adversarial. Then the practitioner emphasized with Sean and his mother, you must both be really scared to death about what might happen. And the shift was immediate. Sean's jaw relaxed, his mom's shoulders dropped, and then the practitioner asked permission to offer a word of advice. So they agreed, and the practitioner said, Sean, people make mistakes, but those mistakes don't have to define who they are and what they become. And from what you've told me before, this behavior is not the person that you want to be. You've told me about other bigger hopes and dreams. And regardless of what happens in there, you still have the opportunity to choose the type of person that you become. What do you think about that? And so Sean mumbled a non-committal, I don't know. And then time was up. Sean's mom was dialing the attorney as the practitioner walked away. Sean was looking out the window. And they returned shortly to tell the group that the meeting was over and all future meetings would happen only with an attorney present. Sean was already suspended and withdrew from school a few days later. So clearly this meeting did not go as everyone had hoped. What do we do different? So we need to look for indicators that a change might happen. So I want to focus our attention to markers that indicate change that is unlikely to happen. Miller and Rolnick have kind of struggled to define what these markers reflect. Originally, they used the term resistance, but then over time, kind of became dissatisfied with that label. And more recently, Miller and Rolnick and other MI trainers have begun to differentiate between statements that reflect active resistance to interventions and those that express acceptance or benefits of the status quo. So this type of client language should be referred to as sustained talk, and kind of note parallels with the different forms of change talk. So specifically, this is when the client is expressing a desire to sustain the status quo, or an inability to change, or the benefits of the current situation, or even just a need for the status quo. Commitment talk for the status quo is also going to happen. A desire for things to stay the same is not an uncommon experience. Graduation each year is a reminder of children growing up and venturing into the world. As much as parents nurture and encourage growth and development and independence, there may also be a part of us that will miss them terribly and then therefore wishes it wouldn't happen. And then similarly, when clients have change thrust upon them by others or by their circumstances, they're going to lament the possibility of losing the status quo. And even when that's not the case, the clients might still wish that they didn't have to give up all the aspects of a particular behavior. So in the realm of addictions, this idea is kind of expressed in a quip that clients don't give up, or they don't want to give up their addictions, just the consequences of the addiction. And that connection to the status quo is the expression of the other side of ambivalence. And there's a lot of reasons why clients might not want to give up their current situation. They may believe that their strengths and their skills and their abilities lie within these domains only. So, for example, they know how to function within a substance abusing world. They may know how to get the money and how to acquire the drugs and how to maintain relative safety while doing that. But then on the flip side, they may know very little about functioning in other parts of the world or without the substance. So their knowledge and skills lie within a world that they know, even as they're, recognizing that it doesn't really serve them well. And clients may have very little hope that things could improve. Either the change is not possible, or even if it is possible, it's unlikely to result in a better situation. Salespeople, for example, may stay in a job with an overbearing boss because their experience indicates that, bosses are always this way. There's no reason to expect that a job change would lead to a better situation. Better the devil you know. But there may be things that the client receives from their situation as it's currently configured. Homebound people with agoraphobia don't have to face the fear-inducing situations as long as they stay home. The immediate benefits of staying home seem to far outweigh the long-term benefits of the greater freedom of choice. And so clients might also observe the disadvantage of change. After all, the risks are associated as well as considerable free time for what may be a low-paying, high-effort, and minimal respect job. Risks might also be interpersonal in nature. The effects of trying and failing may be much worse to the client's sense of self-competence and self-esteem than is the self-degradation that accompanies their current situation. So these types of client views could indicate that they're thinking about or they're committed to these things as they currently stand, although they might consider making a change. Change is unlikely to happen as long as these status quo factors are outweighing the benefits or the needs for change. So these client statements are going to represent one aspect that kind of weighs down the against change side of the ambivalence scale. In contrast, resistance is going to involve an active pushing against the practitioner personally, even if it's apparently in a passive form. So, for example, what appears to be compliance can be a form of resistance. So let me give you an interaction with a healthcare provider kind of as an example here. This provider was a well-meaning, dedicated individual who I'm sure was very frustrated with the client's diabetes management at times. And so she would praise the client for efforts at improved self-care, but would also scold the client for areas that needed improvement. And the client's A1C control was generally good, and there was room for improvement. So at first, the client tried to explain to her why her suggestions were difficult for the client to implement. And I'm sure that the client's behavior looked like active resistance. So the client's frequent yes, but responding, this practitioner knew very well. And her response was to re-emphasize the importance to long-term health and to warn the clients of any possible dire consequences, all of which are true and all of which the client was well aware of. And then over time, the practitioner learned that, she really did not understand the client's situation. And although her heart was good, her aim was bad. And it was just easier to agree to her suggestions and state that the client was going to try rather than to endure the extended lectures. And so that's what the client did. On the surface, the interactions were friendly. And although the client listened to the suggestions without argument, the client rarely implemented them in a manner that she specified. A more active form of resistance happens when the client directly argues with the practitioner. So the client might argue that driving under the influence results are wrong, and the client may contend that the practitioner doesn't know about this kind of child who needs a firm hand, like a hard smack to show that you really mean business. Or the client may believe that playing video games and instant messaging have no direct effects on their study habits and resent your implication that they're linked. Or they may talk over you, contending that, hooking up really is a low risk activity. Or they believe that, every fall, most people become more irritable and moody. And that's because they have to spend more time indoors. And so they're refusing to talk about seasonal depression. Or they may discount your expression of concern and contend that everything's fine because they're juggling 3 children and a full-time job and multiple volunteer activities and seeing friends regularly, even though their partner complains about their pace and their lack of couple time. Not only have we heard these things, we've probably done them as well. But unfortunately, with our clients, we've tended to label these behaviors as expressions of denial. And the reality seems evident to us, but the other person just doesn't see it that way. And when it's our own denial under review, we readily see the reality of the environmental pressures that influence our behavior. Social psychologists label this phenomenon as the fundamental attribution error, and as well as the correspondence bias or over attribution effect. So that is when we observe others, we tend to give greater weight to internal attributes leading to the behavior and underestimate the effects of the environment. And when we observe our own behavior, we give much greater weight to the environmental influences and less to our own characteristics. So it's not much of a surprise then that clients are going to discount or ignore practitioners. We just don't understand their point of view. There was a young man who was forced to see a counselor, and so he was spinning in his chair for an entire 50 minutes without talking. And clearly, he wished to communicate that even though he had to be there, the counselor could not make him talk. So the counselor had gotten the message pretty clear after about 10 minutes, but the client had sized him up as a slow learner and decided that the counselor needed a whole hour to get the message straight. So during the next session, the two of them left the therapy room and shot baskets on a nearby playground. And then he was quite willing to talk, apparently having set the ground rules, and with a change of venue, he was ready to chat. So the clients are going to interpret or talk over the practitioners. And this situation is often evident in classrooms where teachers are struggling to maintain control. The more the teacher tries to clamp down on that kind of behavior, the stronger becomes the response. Another common example is discounting the counselor. So the client might say, "What do you know? How could you understand me?" An adolescent child once asked a practitioner, "What are you, my rent-a-friend?" So resistance is also going to present as a filibuster. The client takes up the floor and refuses to yield. And that can also happen in groups where one member is monopolizing the time and others just simply cede the control or actively look to their peer to take the focus from themselves. Clients can just simply change the subject. My youngest child is a preschooler, and he is a master of this activity. So I'll say, "Okay, your 5 minutes are up. It's bath time." And then my son will say, "5 more minutes." And I'll say, "No, we already did 5 minutes." He said, "Have you seen my teddy bear?" "No, Kai, it's bath time. I'll give you the extra 5 minutes. I already gave you the extra 5 minutes, so let's hit the bathtub." "My unicorn's name is Cotton Candy." "Yes, Kai, I know. Hi, Cotton Candy. Why don't you ride her up to the tub?" "I love you, Mommy. I want to give you a big kiss. And now a hug." "Okay, thank you, Kai. It's still bath time." "Okay, 5 more minutes." Clearly, I am overmatched here, right? Which leads us to the question, so what do you do with the sustained talk and the resistance? While it may be tempting to try to bust through it, this strategy is going to be rarely helpful from an MI perspective. Instead, the recommendations involve returning to familiar skills and then adding a few strategies. I want to focus on 3 reflective listening skills. First, we can use simple reflections. So these skills keep the conversation in motion and allow you to direct it depending on the elements that you address. So simple reflections can be helpful with sustained talk, and they're particularly useful with very strong resistance that's leaving you temporarily flustered or even kind of discombobulated. When a client hits you with a jolting statement, a simple reflection can buy you some time as you're figuring out how you might proceed more effectively. So for example, a client who says, "I'm going to go drink myself to death," may leave you very uncertain of how to proceed here. So a safe response might be, "So you're going to drink until you die?" And this response does not change the meaning, and it stays close to the client's words. Even a minor shift in the simple reflection focus may alter the client perspective. So at this point, you're going to drink until you die. The phrase "at this point" opens the door to other possible futures. So the amplified reflections are also going to be helpful in responding to statements endorsing the status quo. So these skills are going to allow you to kind of press on the sustained talk to determine the degree of commitment to the statement, as well as to explore the person's intent. So for our client who says, "I'm going to drink myself to death," the amplified response might be, "and you can't see any purpose in living." So this statement is kind of pressing the client to see if there's really no reason, or simply to see if the preponderance of the evidence is falling in one direction. And it may also point to aspects that are more ambivalent. And then a final reflective skill is the double-sided reflection that kind of contrasts the status quo with other elements that the client have shared or might possibly consider, or are implied within their statements. So again, to our client intent on drinking until she dies, we might say, "So at this point, you're feeling this way and you haven't always felt this way." Or an alternative response is, "For now, you expect to die drinking. And on the other hand, you recognize that you might change your mind." So there's a number of strategic elements that we can use to respond to resistance and sustained talk. So we have recognizing personal choice and control, and then also shifting focus. Both of these approaches are going to utilize our ORS micro skills, but they're also going to include a strategic choice to alter the interaction pattern. I always find it helpful to make the obvious obvious. This is like naming whatever's happening or is influencing the situation, but maybe hasn't been acknowledged so that it can really be addressed directly. So in this instance, making the obvious obvious is going to involve reminding clients that, only they can choose to change their behavior. And in the end, it's entirely up to each person to decide if a change is needed and how that change is going to happen. Even in situations where people appear to have very little choice, they still choose, even if it's passively. So, for example, the alleged DUI driver may choose to go to jail rather than to accept treatment. And some clients are going to grumble that they didn't have a choice. And they must do this, whatever this is, or someone, or else somebody else is going to enforce a consequence on them. So the temptation is to argue that it's still a choice. I've certainly done that. And so we're going to be served much better when we use our ORs. So it's going to sound more like, "Hey, it feels like a really crummy choice to you. What do you think you're going to do?" So the client may say, "I guess I'll do it." And then, obviously I'm going to respond with, "You don't really want to." And the client will say, "Isn't that obvious?" So I might say, "It really makes you mad that you're in this circumstance." So the client might respond with, "It pisses me off when people tell me what to do." So that's what I'm going to say, "And that's how it feels now, even though you don't know that only you can decide if you're going to go along with the treatment or not." So this type of interchange is not uncommon. And although the client is unsatisfied with the direction that they're choosing, the approach is going to allow us as practitioners to come alongside the client as they're facing this unwanted decision. And this position is going to be better suited from an MI perspective for helping the clients move forward more than like an adversarial position where the practitioner is continuing to assert a limit. The second strategy is shifting the focus. So this approach is going to acknowledge that we've run into an area that doesn't feel like we're going to be productive. And as a result, we're going to shift the focus to an area that may be more helpful or productive for the client. And this shift is typically accomplished by either a reflection or a summary followed by a question. So continuing the dialogue from that last example I just gave you, a shift in the focus might be like, "And that's how it feels now," even though you know you can only decide if you're going to go along with the treatment or not. So the client's going to be like, yeah, I guess. And so I'm going to say, you're not crazy about the choice, but it seems like for now you've decided to hang with this, at least for a little while longer. And I wonder what for you would be helpful to spend time on today. What would need to happen for you to leave today and feel like you got something from this? So Bill Miller, in a video demonstration on the use of MI there was a man talking about how cigarette and alcohol use affected his life. And he was a soccer guy. And so he uses this simple question to shift the focus. What would you like to be different? And then Terry Moyers, in her video with a man presenting for a DUI evaluation, she asks, what would you like to do here today? And Steve Rollnick uses a prop or like an agenda menu from which the clients can choose an area of focus. And so this menu includes like blank items where the client is going to determine what would be inserted there. And contained within these queries is like this joining process where the clients are asked to choose a direction and the practitioner respects the client's ability to decide what they need. And some practitioners might worry what clients will, that the clients are going to take a totally inappropriate focus to avoid dealing with the problem. And when clients choose that direction that seems off task, the clinicians may feel compelled to redirect the conversation to a problem area. And that's where we're going to have to put agenda setting into focus. When expressing a concern is a focus, maybe that might be an area where we need to spend a little bit more time. But for now, let's just suffice it to say that MI respects that clients make the choices and that it must be their agenda, not ours. If change is to happen, they have to choose it. And if we insist on this session focus or on a particular change, we are more likely to get at most just temporary compliance more than true change. Some other strategies for managing resistance or sustained talk would be reframing, agreement with a twist, and siding with the negative. These represent skillful forms of reflective listening, and these approaches require that practitioners employ reflections deftly and on demand so that when the need arises, they can be done naturally and with empathy. The goal is not to make the clients comfortable, but instead to bring them face to face with difficult realities, which may be at odds with their position, without engendering more resistance. So these techniques are going to require considerable skillfulness and maybe a little bit more advanced for this particular 4-hour training. So in practice, these strategies tend to emerge more spontaneously and without intention from the practitioner, maybe with the exception of like siding with the negative. So the first strategy is reframing. A reframe is going to place the client's statement in a new light, a new perspective, so to speak. And this approach often involves taking the resistant or the sustained talk element and just recasting it. Holding one's liquor, for example, is addressed as tolerance and the risks associated with that condition made explicit. Or reluctance to come to a session is recast as, strength in pushing forward despite their concerns. Or multiple past failures in changing behavior are reframed as continued commitment to making life better. So in the context of the dialogue that I just used, we might reframe. And so it's going to look like this. It feels like a really crummy choice to you. What do you think you're going to do? So the client says, I guess I'll do it. And I'll say, you don't really want to. And the client says, isn't that obvious? And so I might say to reframe, so you're the kind of guy who can decide what needs to be done and then do it, even when you don't like it. And that seems like a real strength that probably has served you well over your life. Agreement with a twist typically involves a simple reflection followed by a reframe. So we might use a complex reflection here too, and we might not even use a reflection at all, but just the agreement, like, I think you're right. But regardless on the specific form, the interaction begins with a statement that appears very consistent with what the client has just said. And then by virtue of the reframe, the client lands in a totally unexpected direction. So Miller and Rolnick use the metaphor of jujitsu to explain this technique. Jujitsu is a martial art where an aggressor's energy is not opposed, but instead redirected. So, concerned with the power dynamics inherent in this analogy, Miller and Rolnick moved away from it and toward an image of like ballroom dancing, where the slight presses and pulls by the lead dancer are going to direct the pair to move in new directions. So, regardless of the analogy, the underlying idea is the same. Don't oppose the energy, instead, gently just redirect it in productive ways. An example of this agreement with a twist might look like the client says, "It pisses me off when people tell me what to do." So I'm going to respond with, "Yeah, it makes you mad, particularly because you know when you're making good choices and when you aren't, and you don't need anyone to tell you that." So that first sentence is just a simple reflection, it makes you mad, right? That's clearly just a simple reflection. But the second statement inserts an element not directly expressed but implicit in the client's statement. And so the result is going to be that the client's energy is now focused in a new direction of making good choices. And in this repeated exchange, multiple directions can be used to respond to the sustained talk or to the resistance. And as I said earlier, when the resistance is particularly strong or unbalances the practitioner, it's usually easiest to begin with just a simple reflection, and that's going to give you time to regain your footing. And it's also typically true that a single exchange does not entirely drain the resistance of its power. So a series of exchanges are going to be needed. So the first response does not have to be perfect, but it kind of just sets a beginning course. And if it's not already evident, it should be noted that resistance takes considerable energy to sustain. And if the practitioner does not push against this energy, the resistance often drops. And sometimes that happens relatively quickly. Some moms, when the kids are fighting and blaming each other for whatever, the parent might say, it takes two to tango. So finally, there is siding with the negative or coming alongside. And this is not reverse psychology. It's just a simple acknowledgement that this may not be the right time, place, or circumstance for change. And this is a little bit more advanced because it kind of leaves us as practitioners and the clients in the unfortunate position of feeling stuck. And sometimes feeling stuck can be quite helpful, to fully experience the discomfort of the current circumstance in order to kind of mobilize the client's resources for change. But it can also leave new practitioners unsure of what to do next. So the exchange might go like this. The client says, "Oh, it's hopeless. It seems like there's no point in changing now." And the practitioner may respond with, "Yeah, so maybe that train has left the station." The hope in providing this type of reflection is that the client is going to more fully explore the situation and determine if the conclusion drawn is a correct one. And that's going to require that the practitioner be able to sit with the discomfort. And that's quite challenging. In an Edinburgh interview, we see an MI clinician sitting with a client who says that he expects to drink himself to death, just as his father did before him. And through the process of accepting this position and then exploring it further, we see that this practitioner and the client moved to a much more hopeful position. So in that commentary, we learn about how uncomfortable this process was for the clinician, even as she's maintaining her "am I consistent" stance. And the approach does not have to be dramatic. Returning to our familiar dialogue that I've been using, the exchange goes like this. Client says, it feels like, or they say whatever they said. And so we're going to respond with, it feels like a crummy choice to you. What do you think you're going to do? And the client says, I guess I'll do it. And so we may respond with, well, you could. On the other hand, you might decide you're willing to pay the price because it's that important to you to not feel pressured into a choice. Again, here, attitude is going to be critically important here. You don't want to sound like you're being sarcastic or manipulative. That's going to make the client react strongly. The practitioner has to be genuine.